On October 5th, 2018, the silence of the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest was broken by the hum of a high-profile film crew. The location was the Penman Mine, a jagged, remote stretch of Idaho wilderness where the earth is scarred by old gold shafts and timber so thick it swallows the light. Among the 12-member team from the UK-based Raw TV was 27-year-old Terrence Woods Jr. He wasn't a novice or a tourist. He was a rising star in the industry, a producer whose career had already taken him from the streets of London to the deserts of Egypt and the ruins of Turkey. He was a man used to high-pressure environments and complex logistics. But as the crew prepared for a routine shoot that Friday afternoon, the production schedule was suddenly abandoned. Without a word or a warning, Terrence dropped his gear to the forest floor and began a dead-heat sprint away from the set. According to his colleagues, he moved with a speed and intensity that left the veteran crew frozen in disbelief. Today, we are tracing the chaotic, contradictory minutes that turned a professional film set into the epicenter of a mystery that defies every law of logic. The geography of the Penman Mine is a vertical nightmare. It is a place of crumbling rock and deadfall, tangled piles of fallen timber that make even a slow walk treacherous. On the afternoon of October 5th, the Raw TV crew was wrapping up a day of filming when they say the impossible happened. According to the people there, Terrence Woods Jr. basically exploded into a run out of nowhere. The crew described a scene that sounds more like an action movie than a mountain rescue. They claimed Terrence suddenly dropped his radio and his gear, sprinted toward a steep cliff edge, and launched himself off a 10-foot drop. In their version of events, he hit the ground like an Olympic gymnast and kept moving, his clothes tearing against the sharp brush as he scrambled down a 45-degree incline. They described his speed as hare-like, claiming he was a mere blur of motion before disappearing into the dark maw of the forest as if pulled by an invisible wire. But when this story reached Terrence's father in Maryland, the facts began to collide with biological reality. Terrence was not an elite athlete. He was a 27-year-old man who was famously flat-footed. His father recalled how Terrence would sometimes trip just navigating a standard flight of stairs. More importantly, Terrence was still physically recovering from a traumatic injury, a broken pelvis sustained during his time in London. The physics didn't add up. A man with a history of pelvic fractures does not stick a 10-foot landing on jagged mountain terrain and then outrun a dozen witnesses. If Terrence had truly jumped, there should have been the sound of snapping branches, the sight of disturbed earth, or a trail of blood from the shredded clothing the crew mentioned. Yet, when the search dogs arrived, they found a vacuum. No scent, no footprints, no evidence that a human being had ever touched that slope. For the investigators, it was as if Terrence had simply stepped off the edge of the world. The sheer logistics of the crew's pursuit add another layer of mechanical disbelief. A group of 11 other people, some presumably younger, some likely fitter, and all supposedly watching him, could not manage to close the gap or even maintain a visual on a man running through dense, unfamiliar brush. In a forest that thick, a sprint is usually measured in feet, not miles, before a runner hits an obstacle or loses momentum. Yet, the crew maintained that Terrence moved with a chilling, singular purpose, as if he knew the terrain better than the locals who lived there. By the time they reached the edge of the drop, the hare was gone, leaving behind only an abandoned radio and a silence that felt heavy with things left unsaid. In the television industry, your reputation is your currency. Before stepping foot in Idaho, Terrence Woods Jr.'s professional bank account was overflowing. He was widely regarded as a rising star, a man whose resume read like a travelogue for the elite: London, Egypt, Turkey. Peers from major networks, and even the same company, Raw TV, had previously described him as exceptional, ahead of the curve, and reliable under pressure. This was a man who navigated the high-stakes, high-stress environments of international film sets with a calm, prepared demeanor. He was the person colleagues recommended when a job required a level head and a sharp eye. However, within 24 hours of arriving at the Idaho location, a second, unrecognizable version of Terrence began to emerge, one authored entirely by the crew. Following his disappearance, the narrative shifted from professional excellence to psychological instability. The production team suddenly portrayed Terrence as a man in the throes of a profound mental collapse. They claimed he was confused, unable to fulfill simple equipment requests, and even reached a state where he was unable to get lunch. They reported that he had suffered an anxiety attack so severe that they had to physically detain him earlier that day. This wasn't the Terrence his family knew. It was a character written to fit a tragedy. The contradiction is as sharp as a camera cut. There is no record of the crew ever calling for medical assistance, documenting these alleged attacks, or seeking professional help for a colleague they claimed was losing his grip on reality. For a high-level production company used to strict safety protocols and liability management, the lack of a paper trail for a detained employee is a glaring anomaly. To his father, these descriptions felt less like an investigation and more like a performance review. The crew's focus seemed to dwell more on his perceived failures as a producer in his final hours than on the mechanics of how he actually vanished. While the crew was painting a picture of a man unraveling, Terrence's own digital footprint told a different story. One of a professional simply counting down the days until his departure. On October 1st, just 4 days before he vanished, Terrence sent a text to his father. It wasn't a cry for help or a message of confusion. It was a logistical update. He told his father he was coming home early and had already officially changed his flight to October 10th. To those who knew him, this was a man who had finished his work and was looking toward the finish line, not someone planning a suicidal sprint into a mountain range. Producer had been replaced in the official record by a man who was allegedly too unstable to hold a radio, leaving behind a family in Maryland who didn't recognize a single word of the story. Adding to the unease is the mystery of the young woman at the restaurant. A crew member claimed that shortly before the disappearance, Terrence had met a woman while the group was dining together. It was presented as a small detail, a passing interaction in a small-town eatery, but it remains a dead end. No one has ever been able to identify her, and no one else in the busy restaurant could confirm the encounter. This shadowy figure, much like the new Terrence described by the crew, exists only in the testimony of those who were there when he ran. When the 911 call finally echoed through the dispatch center, the information provided was a labyrinth of backstory rather than a clear set of coordinates. Instead of a frantic report of a missing person's last known location, the caller spent valuable minutes detailing Terrence's supposed emotional state, claiming he had never been in the woods before and was having a difficult day. The transcript of that call contains a chillingly prophetic line. The reporting crew member stated that Terrence was not going to respond to responders, and that he had no communication. It was a statement that seemed to close the door on a rescue before the first siren even sounded. As the search intensified, a massive digital void began to emerge. In any modern disappearance, the first step is to ping the victim's cell phone, to find the last tower it hit and triangulate a location. Yet, in Terrence's case, no cell phone pings were ever requested by the local authorities, and no detailed cell records were pulled in those first critical hours. This technical oversight meant that while helicopters circled above, the digital breadcrumbs Terrence carried in his pocket remained unread. The physical search that followed was one of the most intensive in the history of the Idaho County Sheriff's Office. Over the course of a week, the silence of the Penman Mine was replaced by the roar of helicopters, the mechanical growl of ATVs, and the steady footfalls of over 120 ground searchers. They deployed infrared scans designed to pick up a heat signature in the freezing mountain night. They brought in elite K-9 units, trained to catch a scent, even days after a disappearance. They crawled into the dark, suffocating shafts of the mine itself, expecting to find a man huddling in the shadows. But the mountain remained a blank page. Despite the crew's vivid description of a man sprinting through the brush with shredded and bloody clothing, the forest floor yielded nothing. There were no snagged threads on the low-hanging branches, no scuff marks on the steep 45-degree incline, and most importantly, no blood. The search dogs, capable of tracking a scent through miles of wilderness, could not find a single trace of Terrence, not even at the very spot where he supposedly leaped from the cliff. In a landscape where a single broken twig can tell a story, Terrence Woods Jr. had vanished without leaving a signature. In a move that haunts the Woods family to this day, the local authorities never searched Terrence's hotel room. When his luggage was eventually returned to his father, it contained a final, inexplicable clue. The only worn item in his bag was a single pair of dress shoes. They were caked in mud and carefully wrapped in a plastic bag. Yet the clothes that should have accompanied them were nowhere to be found. In the heart of Oro Grande, a town where locals warn outsiders that people go missing all the time, the massive effort eventually dissolved, leaving behind nothing but an empty space where Terrence used to be. The mystery of Terrence Woods Jr. didn't end on the slopes of the Penman Mine. It shifted into the sterile rooms of police stations and the silent offices of a London production house. In the weeks following the disappearance, the Idaho County Sheriff's Office made a decision that would haunt the Woods family for years. They stopped the active search. Despite the lack of a single physical clue, no clothing, no blood, no scent, authorities ruled out foul play. They pivoted to a narrative of a lone man wandering into the wilderness, a theory that conveniently closed the book on any further forensic scrutiny of those who were last seen with him. The actions of Raw TV in the wake of the tragedy only deepened the shadow. Rather than staying to support the search or the devastated family flying in from Maryland, the production crew left Idaho almost immediately. They departed without their colleague, leaving behind a wake of unanswered questions and a refusal to release the full names of every crew member present that day. While the company offered slim to any help, reports surfaced that at least one crew member had begun seeking intensive counseling, specifically because of the events of that trip. Whatever happened in those woods, it was enough to break the professional composure of a veteran film crew, yet not enough to keep them on the mountain. For Terrence Woods Sr., the official version of his son's final moments is a fiction he refuses to sign. He points to the baffling state of Terrence's luggage, the mud-caked dress shoes wrapped in plastic, the missing clothes he should have been wearing over those 4 days, and the total lack of used personal items in his bags. These aren't the signs of a man in a sudden psychological break. They are the signs of a timeline that doesn't fit the evidence. How does a man who supposedly never left the set end up with mud-caked dress shoes neatly packed in a bag, while the clothes on his back and his very body evaporate into thin air? Today, the case remains in a haunting legal limbo, open but inactive. The Idaho Sheriff's Department refuses to close the file, yet they admit no work is being done to solve it. Terrence's father continues to lobby the FBI, his voice a lone alarm in a forest of silence. He marks every birthday with a public plea, reminding the world that his son, a talented, globally traveled producer, did not simply run like a hare into oblivion. He reminds us that in the rugged silence of Oro Grande, a story was cut short, and until the cameras are turned back on the contradictions of that October afternoon, the credits on the life of Terrence Woods Jr. will never truly roll.